Olá, pessoal. Boa tarde. Já almoçaram? Todo mundo? Muito bem. Quem está aqui do meu lado é o Alexei. Ele ficou até um pouco impressionado com a popularidade dele aqui no Brasil. E uma das razões é, logicamente, lead time. Algumas pessoas até chamam ele de Alexei lead time. Right? E, galera, só dando mais uma reforçada, não se esqueçam que quando chegar o próximo break, que vai ser às 4h10, nós vamos ter link-off nessa sala e open space lá na L'Orangerie. Tá claro? Vamos se engajar aí para trocar experiência, para fazer aí novas conexões. Então, Alexei, it's your stage.
Thank you, Rodrigo. All right, hello, everyone. So, my talk today will be about one Kanban metric. Rather, it's not really a Kanban metric. It's a metric for your business. And surprisingly, it's a metric for every business. Just one, but there is a lot to know about it. So I'll bring you the latest we know, the latest we've learned in our professional community. So a few words about myself. Thank you, Rodrigo, for the introduction. I'll just take it a little bit further. So Alexei Zheglov, I come from Canada. That's where I live. It's my adopted country. Those of you who know me also know that I speak fluent Russian because I was born and grew up in St. Petersburg. So there's half of my life over there and another half in the New World. I consider myself a maker of things, and in the 1980s I started computer programming as a hobby. I was a teenager, then I grew up, I started doing it professionally, and then I had done it enough that I started seeing all kinds of problems that companies run into as they try to deliver complex products and services to their customers, and then I started doing something about it, so I became a problem solver and a leader of a different kind. But then, thanks to Kanban, particularly David's Blue Book, I accidentally became a leader of a different order as I help people, companies, businesses to do better. And I'm also a number of things, such as accredited Kanban trainer, Kanban coaching professional, someone who co-wrote the book Fit for Purpose. I also developed a thing known as enterprise services planning, and I sometimes come to speak at conferences like this, but it's the first time in Brazil. Thank you. I have a reputation of a mathematician in the Kanban community, but I am not really a mathematician. I'm just someone who has comfort level with math. So I just want to show it to you by example. I'll give you some numbers, and I'll show you how I look at them. So let's see, is this a number? All right. Is this a number? All right, is this a number? All right, so here's what I see in these numbers. I see if there is a problem. I see if there is a different kind of problem. And I see if there are several kinds of problems. So see, you don't need complicated formulas. You don't need supercomputers. You just need to use your 5 senses, and sometimes it's the sense of smell, to notice these problems. This is how I look at numbers. It's a comfort level thing. Fit for purpose framework. So here's this infographic again. Thank you, the previous speakers. And for the next hour, I'm only going to focus, unlike what they did using their time, I'm only going to focus on a small area of this framework, specifically this corner at around 11 o'clock. And it's about time to market. Time it takes your company to bring something to market and hand it to your customers. Your customer's purpose is always linked to timeline. They want not only something, but that they also know when they want it. And too early, they might not need it, and too late, they may have no use for it. Customer's purpose is always linked to the timeline. Therefore, no matter what business we're in, we need to have delivery capability with lead time that's measurable and understandable. There are 3 components to lead time, as we specified in the framework. And in different businesses, different components matter. Usually at least one of them matters, sometimes 2, rarely all 3. Duration. What's the typical duration of time that it takes to bring some product to the market, to complete some service request, and so on and so forth? Obviously matters a lot in product launches and project work and so on. Predictability. We want to have some confidence, usually 90+%, that the work is going to complete within a certain time and the solution will be delivered to customer. So this is closer to the worst case. And sometimes we need to set such targets. It matters in establishing service level agreements in services. It matters in seasonal or short window of opportunity types of businesses. And sometimes what matters absolutely is timeliness, although short duration and high predictability help achieve that. But the criterion isn't the duration or predictability itself, it's did we meet the fixed date. So if you're in a heavily regulated business, this matters a lot. So I'm going to spend only a few minutes just as the refresher on how to measure this important metric and why we call it this. So Kanban systems help a lot. So this is a generic Kanban system. And just like every Kanban system, it has a first commitment point. This is when you as a business owner commit to delivering something to your customers, but customers commit to taking delivery from you. And then, at some point, you're ready to hand it over. Now, this is a technical definition. And I actually, by the way, I also want to clarify it. You may start by asking how long it will take, but it turns out it's often more practical to replace this question with 2. Ask, when do you want it? And then ask, when should we start in order to be on time? So there are 2 events involved, and one of them precedes or leads, that's another English word, another by this much, the length of this arrow. That's why we call it lead time. And in addition to a technical definition, I also like a very simple intuitive definition. So I'm going to use words that I learned from a keynote speaker 6 years ago at the North American conference, the same conference, but in Boston. He used words, we promise, and here it is. Now that's really intuitive, understandable, plain language. From we promise to here it is. All right, so now we have these definitions. Now that we know this is an important metric, let's consider a few others that matter in what we like to call business agility. What kind of agility exactly does your business require? So it turns out a number of parameters matter. Well, first of all, how fast and how predictable, but also how frequently can you make commitment decisions, and how frequently can you deliver. So the frequencies typically are set based on policies of your company, although if you're a leader of the company, you have power to change that. Sometimes they're set by negotiation with the customer. And again, if you're negotiating with the customer, you have some power to change that. However, the time, it kind of just happens. It is what it is. It's intrinsic capabilities of your company's processes, and it's not that easy to change. But first, we want to measure it. And once we measure it, we can set the standard upon which we want to improve. When and where and how do we measure lead time? So here's a diagram of the so-called 7 Kanban cadences. Those of you, how many people here have taken Kanban Management Professional Level 1 or Level 2 classes? Quite a few people in the room. So you, and by extension, people who work with you, other people in companies where you work, probably know this. Where can we have a look at our lead time? What is the name of that event where we bring in all the data and look at them and see what we can improve and how? What is it called? The service delivery review. It's the central box in the 7 cadences diagram. This is an essential Kanban practice. It's a social practice because you need to get people to participate in it. And this is where you look at your time data. So let's have a look. What do we typically get at service delivery reviews? But before I show you any examples of what we typically get at service delivery reviews, let's make a theory or a hypothesis. Let's say we expect our time to market to look like this. We expect to get this number. All right? So let's make a hypothesis and then see if it matches the reality. So what people typically expect to get for their lead time, they expect a number. Or they expect maybe a number and a little bit of a range around that number. They expect it to be this much, and they expect a little bit of plus minus a little bit around it. Right? So they expect some kind of either a single number or they expect a bell curve. Right? A bell curve centered on the number that they expect, and preferably not very wide bell curve. What do people actually get? It turns out they usually get something completely different. So they get something like this, or sometimes like that, or like that. And so month after month, or week after week, from this service, from this department, from this team, from this business unit, they get diagrams like this. And they start realizing the hypothesis was wrong. Lead time does not conform to our ideas, to our thought experiments about what it is. It is something else. So one important conclusion here is that it is not intuitive. Our intuition tells us one thing, but we find it to be completely different. The reality is different. What do we know about human intuition? It takes a long time to train. Our intuition, the intuitive part of our brain, has to absorb a large number of experiences over a long period of time before it starts recognizing patterns, before it gets used to the reality. And therefore, we can hardly start measuring our lead time, our time in process, our time to market too soon. As I said, service delivery review is a good practice where you can bring some lead time data and have a group of managers look at it, see if it's fit for purpose, and if it's not, can something be done about it? However, how many people here have graduated from a Kanban coaching professional masterclass? Let's see, do we have a critical mass of like 10 people, more than 10 people? Great. All right, these people know that some practices or some novelties in your process or in your organization's procedures can be too much stressor for the organization. And when it's too much, what happens? Well, it's like trying to lift a barbell that is too heavy for you, right? You'd get injured, right? So an organization gets injured if you introduce a practice that is like too heavy barbell, too heavy stressor. And then the organization runs from it. They withdraw and they stop that practice pretty soon and they revert to their old ways. So sometimes a service delivery review is too much transparency and it's too much too soon. However, you can still try to measure, try to get some data even if you don't review it very often socially. So practically, if you are ready to review it in the open at the regular meeting, do it. If not, make sure somebody does collect the data because you can't start it too soon either way. All right, from the title of this speech, you may have gotten some idea that I sometimes like a little bit of mischief and you know, say something funny or you know, make something non-standard even for its own sake. So a couple of years ago, I was giving a speech on a different subject at a different Kanban conference, and I leaned on a certain American politician who was not president yet, and kind of to take some famous words out of something that he said to kind of make my point. So how many people played the Get Kanban game here? There's quite a bit of experience. You know, there's a certain a nasty manager character in that game, and he gets fired at some point, right? So anyway, I basically put the words "you're fired" into someone else's mouth. All right, so today I'm going to lean on a different politician, and you take some help from him in saying the words that he is famous for. And that's because I need to bring you an inconvenient truth. Thank you, Al. Lead time is not a number, it's a probability distribution. So time it takes you to deliver a product to customers, to complete some kind of service request, to solve a problem, deliver a solution to a customer, is a probabilistic phenomenon. It has something to do with probabilities. So we need to understand probabilities, we need to understand the probabilistic nature of time it takes to do some creative work. So let's try to do it. And surprisingly, a lot of insight came from something very simple, traffic lights. So this is a traffic light in the town where I live. And in order to get from the highway to my house, you have to drive along a boulevard and pass 13 traffic lights, and then at the 13th traffic light, you take a right, and that's my street. So, of course, I drove that particular road many times with my kids, and sometimes we played the game, counting the red lights that will stop us along the way. And the kids know, after a period of time, that the typical number of traffic lights that stop us is 3 or 4. But sometimes we get lucky, and it's only 1 or 2. And 0, I don't think it ever happened. Maybe there's a very low chance. It's like winning the lottery. And sometimes we get bad luck, and then it's 5 or 6 or 7. So they've seen all those possibilities, and they roughly know how the dice are loaded, so to speak. All right, so what I did, I actually got some observations of each intersection, and I know that this one has a 65% chance of delay. So roughly 2 times out of 3, you're going to see a red light at this intersection, and you're going to have to get your foot off the gas pedal and press the brake and stop your car. All right, so let's get the data for the rest of them. They actually range anywhere from 2 to 65%. And now let's open an Excel workbook and let's do some, what is this thing called when you simulate probabilities? What? Monte Carlo. Okay, so that's a fancy word. So let's do that. So, so basically what we do is it's a random number generator. So we generate a random number, then we see if how it compares with a certain percentage. Then we know if in this particular simulation we hit the red light or not. And let's just do it a lot of times and then collect all the results and make a chart out of them. Oh, this is what it looks like. So there is indeed a tiny probability to avoid all red lights. There is a very small chance to be so unlucky as to hit 7 of them or more, and the typical numbers, of course, are 3 and 4. All right, now let's complicate our simulation a little bit, and in addition to simulating whether we hit the red light or not, let's simulate some amount of delay. Let's say a random amount of delay between 0 and 60 seconds. Assuming that traffic lights turn over approximately once every minute. So it's just another column in Excel, and we get a slightly different chart. Now, this chart gets me thinking because I think I've seen this somewhere, and it may have been a service delivery review. All right, so how about we keep the same formulas, but we start simulating something different, something that resembles real world, you know? So how about we replace one of the traffic lights with some amount of time due to rework, due to customer feedback? How about we replace another traffic light, a 20% traffic light, with some additional rework? How about we add some kind of release gate along the way? How about we add some dependencies on shared services? By the way, with those, the amount of delay will no longer be fixed between 0 and the maximum time, because you know how those things work. The delay can be infinite at times. So we get a chart that looks like this. Now, as I promised you in the title and the description of my speech, there had to be a fake chart somewhere in this presentation. So this is a fake chart. However, you're laughing. Now, how many of you have done ops review? So it's a kind of advanced Kanban practice, but maybe a few people in the room have done it. Some people have experience with it. All right, some people have experience with it. Very good. So, now imagine this situation. Actually, the way ops reviews run. So there's a lot of managers in the room. Each of them is responsible for some service, and they're supposed to present data from their service. And some people are naturally good at it, and some people are not good at it, and some people might be good at it, but they're just not comfortable yet, and so they delay gathering the data and preparing their presentation where they visualize the data. So now put yourself in the position of a, let's say, service delivery manager who forgot to get the data or who delayed the start, and now they're out of time and they don't have the data, but they have to go to the ops review. And let's say I gave them this fake chart, they inserted it in their presentation, and now you're sitting in the ops review and listening to them. Would you be able to tell the difference? Would you be able to tell this fake chart from a real chart? Would you be able to tell if any of the charts presented at the ops review are fake or real? If all fake charts are like this? No. Because this chart, even though it's fake, It passes the Turing test. Now, it's good news that it passes the Turing test. That means we understand the nature of time well enough to be able to create it completely artificially. All right, so now let's model a real service. So I'm talking to a manager at a bank, which I cannot disclose. And the manager describes some process to me. So they lead a team, the team does some kind of work. This is how they typically work. This is, he tells me some details about their process. And their process has some problems with it, such as they may encounter a defect, and the defect takes them off the happy path in the process, and they start encountering more delays. And the way they deal with some of those delays aren't optimal because they have to interact with other parts of the organization, and those interactions don't exactly work the best way. So he gives me a little bit more detail, a little bit more detail, and a little bit more, and enough. From this information, we can configure, I think, 6 or 7 different sources of delay here. They're all probabilistic. There's some probability of encountering delay, and then there is some penalty to it. This is how much time we have to pay. This is how much longer the work will take. And even those things aren't fixed numbers. There's some probabilities behind them. So we build it all into our spreadsheet. That only takes a few minutes. Then we press the button, we run 10,000 simulations, and we get this. And then the manager says, this is our lead time chart. This is what it really looks like. So it's a very strange chart. What's interesting about it, it has several peaks there. And how many of you have heard the word multimodal in your Kanban training, if you took Kanban training? Okay, very good. This is a multimodal chart. It has multiple peaks or modes in it. Sometimes each mode is a different work item type, a different type of deliverable. So the chart tells us we have to take the whole data set and break it up, and then for each type of work we will get a different chart, and those charts will be simpler and more understandable. No such luck here. This is one work item type. It has 4 modes in it, and they're all probabilistic. So you end up in one of these modes purely by chance. You don't know in which of those peaks a work item will end up when the work is started and promised to the customer. And this is clearly not a very happy situation for a manager, because if we look at the 3rd and the 4th peak of this chart, those times significantly exceed customers' expectations. So this is not a fit for purpose service. All right, so thanks to these techniques and these simulations and engaging with real-world managers responsible for services and products in their companies, and looking at their data, looking at descriptions of their processes, and being able to very realistically simulate those with relatively simple tools, we got to understand that the time to deliver is essentially risk-based. Risk is at the root of it. So now that I said the word risk, there's some good and bad news about it. So the good news is the discipline of risk management is well developed, and we can use some standard risk management techniques to deal with these probabilities and shift them where we need them to be. The bad news is there's some novel techniques in risk management, because this is still an evolving field. It adapts to deal with some new kinds of risks, and that's where the bad news is. But first, let's just summarize the good part. So your lead time is essentially made of risks. You start with the best case scenario, like 3 to 5 days to deliver some product feature in the best case scenario of that particular manager from the bank. And then you add pairs of some likelihood percentage, likelihood that you will encounter some risk, that something bad will happen, and you multiply it by the impact, and the impact is measured in time. So you add up all these risk factors, and the result is your lead time. And even each impact itself can involve some probabilities. All right, so let's have a look at some examples of how how delay risk factors can be isolated. So in this case, a manager was able to split all the deliverables into 2 buckets. So in one bucket, some product feature can be completed by one team in its entirety. And those are the blue items. And then the orange items are all product features that required dependency on another team. So one team's expertise was not sufficient, so they had to go outside their organizational boundaries, place a request to another team, get help from them in order to complete the work. And we can say that orange items take significantly longer amount of time than the blue items, and we can quantify the cost such dependency. So turned out in this particular case, the cost of dependency involved some probability. It's 1 out of 6. Actually, it's not such a big deal. Only 1 out of 6. Well, it's roughly a failure rate of Russian roulette. However, the average delay and the maximum delay were quite significant. So that means there's a small probability of encountering a very large amount of delay. And that small probability times a very large amount of delay, well, actually that's what makes the difference between fit for purpose and not. Because some customer will be that 1 out of 6, and out of those, perhaps 1 in how many is going to observe that that maximum amount of delay, and then they're going to wait awfully long to get their delivery, and then they will say it didn't meet their purpose. Let's consider another example. Again, a manager looked at the data from their process. Of course, the first step is to get the data. And then they were able to see that roughly 30% of all items that they deliver have a dependency on an expert. 70% don't, but 30% do. And they were able to quantify pretty severe effect of that dependency. Again, it's a small probability, but significant impact and sometimes outsized impact. By the way, for KMP2 graduates, where do you typically get such insights? What Kanban practice or what Kanban cadence is involved here? Someone? Out of these 7. Right, someone is whispering risk reviews, yes. So what I effectively just did with my simulator, I ran a risk review in reverse, right? So I loaded all the risk factors, specified the probabilities and the impacts, ran the simulation, here's your realistic chart. In the risk review, you do it exactly the opposite. So you start with the data, and then you start isolating risk factors. So you break it down from the whole. All right, so now I'm going to switch to bad news. So this is the guy who's going to bring some bad news. Good news over. So he wrote 3 very influential books in recent years. He wrote more books, but 3 are sufficient for our purposes today. So the first book is Black Swan. So the Black Swan tells us that various phenomena that deal with probabilities live in kind of 2 very different worlds, and he called them Mediocristan and Extremistan. So Mediocristan is basically the world of bell curves. So it's when you can think something is a number, and there is a little bit of error around it. So it's a range. It's something plus minus a little bit. However, besides that, there is also extremistan. And extremistan is like you don't know how many zeros at the end you're going to get to your number. It's extreme. There's extreme amount of variation there. Sometimes words like Gaussian and Pareto, both are deceased mathematicians, are used, and sometimes there are words thin tails and fat tails. But what exactly a tail here, only mathematicians know, but we just need to know they can be thin and fat. Then Taleb wrote another book called Antifragile. And in that book, he describes that which is fragile. And fragile is something that has downside exposure to extremistan. So meaning bad things that can happen to you are extreme. And if they are, then they can ruin you. Antifragile is the opposite. The good things are unlimited, while the bad things are contained. And then Taleb wrote another book. He wrote it last year and published at the start of this year. And the main thesis of Skin in the Game is you cannot treat the possibility of complete ruin the same way as any other risk. All right, so now the bad news. So lead time can be in extremistan. So this is an example of lead time from an IT operations service in Germany. And initially, it didn't, like when we eyeballed it, it didn't kind of look extreme. And the thing is, extreme distributions are very difficult to see on a histogram. That's because the extremes are on the horizontal range. So it's just so much that fits on one screen that sometimes the extremes cannot properly fit in the picture. So, so working with certain serious mathematicians who are actual mathematicians, who run math models and make money on Wall Street, not just people like me who have comfort level with math. So they actually convinced me to have a closer look at this. And so, sorry folks, for part of the audience, I'm going to use a technical term. So that thing on the right is known as the log-log plot. So for mathematicians in the room, this is something you can do in 1 minute in Excel. So once we make that chart, we can see that linear region at the on the right-hand side of a chart, and that's what statisticians call the fat tail. So, and this is the evidence. This is indeed an extreme distribution. So it has a potential for producing extreme values, meaning extremely long delays, extremely long times it takes to deliver something to a customer. An extremely long time to deliver something to a customer is clearly something we want to avoid at all costs. So it turns out we can measure how extreme these things are, and there's a certain parameter, statistical parameter, it's called alpha, right? So you don't have to be a statistician to understand it. So just remember it's called an alpha, okay? It's a first letter of the Greek alphabet. And the smaller the alpha is, the more extreme your probabilities. So what is 2.9 alpha? Well, this is roughly the risk of loss currency traders run in foreign exchange transactions. And each and every one of these traders who are actually trading currency for a living, they never write an option without a hedge. They always have some kind of backstop that protects their losses. Well, that's some, I don't know what maturity level that is, but basically if you are in foreign exchange business and you sell some kind of option on a foreign currency exchange without a hedge, you lose some amount of money, you get fired the same day, quite unceremoniously. So it's just a no-no. But here's the state of affairs in the information technology industry. These things are all over the place, and they are unhedged. This just tells you something about the state of the industry, the state of the profession of technology management today. So we can have such things inside our business, effectively a ticking time bomb, and not even know about it. So here's a more extreme example from a company I cannot disclose. I cannot even disclose its location. And here we have something a lot worse. So again, we use a similar statistic technique to find that particular linear region, and that's a fat tail, only this one is fatter. This one has an alpha of 1.7, so it's more extreme. Now, to give you an idea what is 1.7 alpha, basically it's more extreme than losses on the stock market. It's more extreme than the Great Depression. Actually, it roughly matches damage from water damage from major hurricanes. It's roughly the amount of risk that no insurance company will underwrite. So virtually all American insurance companies, when they face this type of phenomenon, they lawyer up, they write a lot of fine print, and dear policyholders, if this happens to you, we're not paying for it, feel free to complain to the government, and the government will perhaps give you some subsidy so that you can repair your house if it gets hit with an event like this. But here it is. It's a technology company, and they have this in one of their services. So if what they have effectively, they have some kind of toxic asset on their balance sheet, because one day this thing will explode. So now some of you may be questioning here, what is the connection between Kanban, between some process metrics and whatnot, and business? Well, if you've got some toxic asset on your balance sheet that may basically, do something these things did in the financial crisis 10 years ago, well, this is the evidence whether you have that or you don't have that in your particular technology business. So you don't want to have this in your company. If you do, you have to do something about it, and you have to do it quickly. So extreme lead times in fit-for-purpose terms, they will exceed any forgiving fitness threshold. And if customer fitness thresholds are somewhat demanding, you will sure exceed them. So you can never be fit for purpose. So you will forever run a fragile business. You may also, on occasion, encounter extreme cost of delay. That will really hit you in the pocket. So these are the bad news. These are the real risks that companies run when they do not understand probabilistic nature, risk-based nature of their lead time, their time to market. All right, so getting closer to the conclusion, did I promise some coconuts in the title of my speech? Okay, so this is a coconut. All right, so the part about coconuts is going to be quite technical, so I'll try to kind of balance two things. I know some people in the room are actually technical, and they're going to apply some quantitative techniques in their companies. I want to give you something, folks. At the same time, I'll try to keep it balanced, minding the needs of people who also need to understand things, perhaps in a clearer, more intuitive way, and take some pragmatic action next Monday. All right, so what this coconut represents, I picked it as a visual symbol for a difficult problem. All right, so it's a tough nut to crack, right? So how many of you can relate to this? Let's say you work with a number of people, you work together and you try to solve a problem together, but it's not an easy problem. It's a hard nut to crack. You work, and eventually you crack it, you've got a solution, and then you deliver that solution to a customer. Like, does it roughly match how you work with other people? You solve problems, you deliver solutions to customers. Problems aren't easy, they're like difficult, right? Okay, so this is a visual symbol for a difficult problem to solve. Oh, by the way, do we want to solve difficult problems? Yes, because if we solve easy problems, well, anyone can solve them. We don't have any differentiated business, right? So it's a commodity business. We can't have profit margins, we can't sustain it. Once it becomes too easy, we can't sustain it. It's too much competition. All right, so now I'm going to lean on a certain kind of visionary who actually dealt with this type of problem. He dealt with the problem of time. Right, so time matters to us while we solve a difficult problem. So Volodya Weibull, creator of Weibull distribution, and some of you in the room may have heard of it in connection to, lead time distributions that we get from Kanban systems. So first, I want to tell you a little bit about this man. So, well, he is Swedish. He was an engineer, scientist, and mathematician. But he wasn't only that. And actually, he didn't follow the biography, a typical biography of an academic person. He was a Coast Guard captain for the Swedish military. So he joined it at the age of 17. And he did well. He received several promotions. And 12 years later, at age 29, he became a captain. And while a captain, he started, he got some free time on land, and he started using that free time to take courses at the university in Stockholm. And it took him significantly longer than a full-time university student to graduate. 8 years, in fact. He was 37 when he graduated from the university. He earned his doctorate when he was 45. And now he was an academic, and yet he was a deeply practical person. So he did a lot of research in strength of material and fatigue in equipment reliability. Actually, a lot of his research was commissioned by the militaries. And it was actually quite valued by both military and by the industrialists who needed solutions to practical problems like, we have a piece of equipment, and maybe it's equipment in a factory, or maybe it's a military aircraft or a battleship, and we need to know kind of how likely this thing is to break, and when is the right time to replace it with a newer model, with new equipment. And so he occupied himself with problems like this. And here's the connection of Weibull's ideas. And he got some answers. Here's the connection between his ideas and ours. When he asked, how long will this piece of equipment avoid failure? Basically, what we need to ask is, how long will that coconut avoid failure? Which means how long it will take until we finally crack it, solve a problem, and deliver the solution to customer. So these two problems have very different physical nature, but math is a universal language. It describes using essentially the same formulas and numbers, physical phenomena that have very different nature. That's why we have math, right? So I'm going to have one mathematical slide in this whole speech. So I promise I will click through it very quickly. But for those who need to know, there is a function that is called probability density. So what it really means is we are solving a problem. And now we are at this moment of time. And what's the chance that we will find the solution to this problem in the next second? Well, that's what one of these things is about. Now let's divide that by the probability that the problem will be so difficult and so durable that it will survive unsolved from the start until now. So we get these, we divide one of these things to another, we get what is known as a hazard function. That's a statistical term. And so Weibull realized that he could actually get a lot of answers to the practical problems that the military and the industrialists sought answers to by applying statistical analysis to the actual history of breakages, of failures of materials and equipment. And so, again, a technical note for those who are into studying distributions of lead time. If h of t, if this hazard function is proportional to t to the power k, we get Weibull distribution with the shape k plus 1. So it's basically mathematically fixed. All right, so Weibull modeled very simple, good enough, approximate, and realistic hazards. So here are some of the typical ones. So we can basically tweak the number k, and we can make this thing decline. We can keep it constant over time. We can make it increase linearly, like a straight line going diagonally, or we can make it increase but slowly. And all of those things model all kinds of scenarios in the reliability of military equipment. And all of them, turns out, are relevant when we model the durability of problems that we are trying to crack. And so this gives us a relatively simple categorization of all kinds of risks that we are exposed to with lead time, with time it takes us to complete work and deliver a solution to the customer. So this is the domain of extremistan. This is where we don't want to be, because this is the negative side of our business's balance sheet, and we don't want unlimited big numbers there. So we don't want that. That's not compatible with long-term survival, let alone success to the enterprise. At the same time, we have another domain where Weibull's hazard rises very quickly. It increases faster than linearly. What does this mean? Well, that means work gets done fast and with very little variability. Well, doesn't it sound good? Work happens fast with very little variability, means we deliver fast and very predictably to our customers? No, it's not good news. It just means whatever it is that we're doing is ripe for automation and disruption. And there is sure a competitor somewhere who is already figuring this out. So if you get very little variation in time to deliver something, ask yourself, don't brag about it. Just be paranoid about where the disruption will come from. It will pretty soon. There's too much opportunity in it. And that leaves us with the domain of well-managed knowledge work. And this is where we see lead time charts, like almost exemplary lead time chart from a certain network equipment company that has very predictable process that delivers their product features, something that their executives and customers can really trust. So that is a domain where we don't have extremes, and yet we do have some variation, and we strike the healthy balance. So how do we exactly define these boundaries? There are technical methods for that. They're not important here. Just remember that there's some middle ground between the extremes. So the coconuts. So the coconut, I said, it's several people working together. So if you really work together and you have all the expertise in your team, people gathered around the table to solve the problem, well, good news. You're not going to get any extreme lead times from that, because every time you use any kind of customer feedback, it increases the hazard. It increases the probability that you will finish really soon. So processes that are dominated by feedback, team works, customer gives feedback, they naturally do not produce extremes. In realistic enterprises, however, we have what? We have lots of dependencies between different services. We have lots of sources of delay and blockage. And when those are unattended, when those are poorly managed, that's when you get the extremes. That's when you run really serious risks to the enterprise. So now I'm going to summarize various conclusions. So first, about lead time, what is it? It's an early universal fit-for-purpose criterion. You cannot seriously talk fit-for-purpose and not know about time it takes you to complete work and deliver results to customers without understanding the nature of this phenomenon. It's a key business agility metric, if you care. It's not a number, so we have to respect its probabilistic nature. Variation of lead time is a maturity level indicator. Low maturity businesses generally have a needlessly large variation in lead time, and they have very hard time controlling it. The good news is, whatever the nature of lead time, we finally understand it really well, and it's rooted in risk. And risk means sometimes it's extreme, and extreme distributions pose organizational risk. They create a danger that your enterprise might not survive the next hit. Having understood all of that, here's what we can practically do. First of all, we have to stop asking things like sizes of work items. If that thing matters, what did I just say a couple of minutes ago? Be paranoid about where the disruption to your business will come from. Which means if it matters, that means it's the least of your problems. Manage the risks of delay. Think of traffic lights. Unhide them. Make them as visible as traffic lights on your street. Reduce and eliminate or mitigate. Right? So apply standard risk management techniques. Did you uncover an extreme distribution somewhere in one of your services in your company? Well, that's a big problem, and that's something that has to be attended. So make sure it is attended. Don't waste time on other problems, on smaller problems, less extreme problems. Recognize that real-world enterprises are quite complex, and they will have lots of dependencies because lots of different people have to contribute to a complex product that is worth its profit margins. So acknowledge this, resist temptation to pretend otherwise, resist the temptation to reorganize and refactor all those dependencies. They will come back. You will have to deal with the same problem again. In short, manage flow. That's a third practice of a method that gave name to this conference. And you can also use the Kanban playbook. Use the Kanban system design to reveal all these problems. Use Kanban cadences, particularly the improvement set, to do something about them. Thank you very much.